All right, let's dive straight in. Today's explainer is all about Martin Van Buren. This guy was a political mastermind, but his entire career it's defined by these brilliant, calculated maneuvers mixed with some seriously striking contradictions. So let's look at how he managed to navigate the incredibly treacherous political waters of the early 19th century. I mean, think about it. How exactly does the son of a rural tavern owner reach the absolute highest office in the land, only to completely lose it all? It's a fascinating paradox. We're going to look at a man who skyrocketed to the presidency only to be completely undone by a massive economic disaster and, ironically, his own deeply calculated political moves.
Okay, part one, the tavern politician. Let's look at his early life and his incredible rise.
So picture this. It's 1782 in the rural town of Kinderhook, New York. Young Martin Van Buren is growing up in a situation perfectly designed to create a future politician. His dad, Abraham, ran a successful inn and a small farm. But this tavern, it wasn't just some quiet place to catch some sleep. It was a bustling, chaotic social hub. You had this constant, nonstop flow of travelers moving between New York City and Albany, which exposed young Martin to a super diverse mix of people, both free and enslaved. It was right there, listening to conversations in that tavern, that his early political instincts really took shape. And, just on a personal note, he'd go on to marry Hannah Hoes in 1807, having 5 kids together, though she tragically passed away in 1819, long before he ever reached the White House.
Well, after studying law, he just dives headfirst into New York politics. And he didn't just casually join the Democratic-Republican Party, he practically rocketed through the ranks. He ended up leading the highly influential Bucktail faction. It really proved he was an absolute natural at building powerful political networks right from the ground up. Seriously, his political ascent was dizzying, like blink and you'll miss it. In 1821, he's elected to represent New York in the U.S. Senate. He holds that seat until he resigns to become the governor of New York. But get this, he barely even had time to unpack his bags in the governor's mansion. He served for just a blip before accepting the incredibly prestigious role of Secretary of State for President Andrew Jackson. Which brings us to Section 2, the Jackson Alliance, a truly defining era for him. Now, it was in Jackson's cabinet that Van Buren forged an alliance that literally changed the course of his life. And it all kicked off with some major cabinet drama. Van Buren very shrewdly sided with President Jackson during the scandalous Petticoat Affair, which involved Secretary of War John Eaton and his wife. This whole mess completely fractured the cabinet. As Jackson's relationship with his vice president, John C. Calhoun, went up in flames, Jackson nominated Van Buren to be the U.S. minister to the U.K. Well, during the Senate confirmation hearing, VP Calhoun gets his chance at revenge. He delivers this decisive, tie-breaking nay vote to block Van Buren. Calhoun was absolutely positive this would destroy Van Buren's career, but actually, it completely backfired. The whole stunt just brought Van Buren closer to Jackson and skyrocketed his reputation among Democrats. Yeah, instead of ruining him, Calhoun's little maneuver practically handed Van Buren the keys to the kingdom. President Jackson immediately tapped Van Buren to join his 1832 ticket as vice president. And after they won, Van Buren wasn't just a VP sitting on the sidelines. He became Jackson's absolute closest advisor and confidant.
Moving on to Section 3, the 8th president, succeeding Jackson. So when Jackson decided to step down after 2 terms, Van Buren was the obvious choice to take the reins. He had that Northern appeal, plus a rock-solid commitment to Jackson's agenda. He beats out a crowded field in 1836, and once he's in the Oval Office, he doubles down on many of Jackson's most severe policies. Sadly, this included the brutal, forcible removal of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands. And significantly, he actually became the very first president to use the word slavery in an inaugural address, doing so to explicitly affirm his unwavering support for the institution. But, he wasn't just a copy-paste version of Jackson. The two men actually had a massive disagreement when it came to Texas. While Jackson and a lot of Southern delegates were pushing hard for westward expansion, Van Buren pushed back. He firmly opposed the annexation of Texas. Why? Well, he calculated that bringing in a massive new territory that allowed slavery would just spark catastrophic political discord at home and, on top of that, likely trigger a full-blown war with Mexico. Still, despite his caution on Texas, his pro-slavery stance was very clearly demonstrated in the courts. His administration directly intervened on behalf of the Spanish government in the incredibly famous United States versus Amistad case. Everyone at the time viewed this as a blatant defense of slavery.
though it's definitely worth noting that the administration ultimately lost that case at the Supreme Court. All right, Section 4, Economic Panic and Defeats. The Panic of 1837.
So while Van Buren is busy navigating all these tense, high-stakes legal and political battles, a massive economic disaster strikes right at home. The Panic of 1837 triggers one of the absolute worst economic depressions this young country had ever seen. And critics wasted no time pointing out a rather ugly contrast. On the one hand, you have everyday, ordinary Americans out there struggling just to put food on the table. And on the other, while critics were loudly accusing President Van Buren of living this lavish, luxurious lifestyle in the White House. Interestingly enough, he actually relied on a mix of both free and enslaved African Americans to run the president's house, something he'd also done earlier at Decatur House. But the public outrage was squarely focused on his household spending. And honestly, the visual contrast was just a total nightmare for his public image. I mean, you could probably guess how this played out at the ballot box. This devastating image of a supposedly lavish, out-of-touch president during a brutal depression matched up against the massive rock star popularity of the Whig candidate, war hero William Henry Harrison, it was just too much. That combination was a direct, fatal blow to Van Buren's 1840 re-election campaign. Finally, Section 5, the Free Soil Finale. One last attempt. Fast forward to 1844, and Van Buren is perfectly positioned to take back the Democratic Party. But remember his stance on Texas? Yeah, his refusal to annex it deeply angered Southern delegates and expansionists, and it literally cost him the nomination. So what does he do? In 1848, he makes one last completely unexpected attempt to get back to the White House. He runs as the presidential candidate for the Free Soil Party. Now, he didn't win. Major General Zachary Taylor took the election, and Van Buren permanently retired to his estate at Lindenwold, where he lived until he passed away in 1862. But here is the kicker. The Free Soil Party was quite literally founded to oppose the expansion of slavery into the Western territories, which leaves us with this jaw-dropping historical paradox. How does a man who used his own inaugural address to loudly support slavery and who used his administration to defend it in the Amistad case somehow finish his political career as the national face of a party fighting against its expansion? Was it some genuine evolution of his personal morality, or was it just the final calculating maneuver from the ultimate political tactician? I'll let you decide.